Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share. So I'll be talking about wetlands in the Yolo bypass and migratory birds. And little background to get started. The Yolo bypass wildlife area is a 16,000 acre state-owned property, not too far from Sacramento. It was established in 1994, largely for the preservation of wetlands and migratory birds. And you can see the map there on the right. That red box is approximately where it is. And you can see how close it is to downtown Sacramento. From this picture there, those are the buildings in downtown Sacramento. So I'm really in the interface of urban areas. Really, West Sacramento is right up against the far eastern edge of the wildlife area. But tremendous wildlife habitat. And so we kicked off some research to really start looking at the very basic question: why are these wetlands so important to migratory birds? And the Central Valley itself is home to millions of waterfowl each winter. Any given day in December or January, counts that we've been doing, we're doing from the ground, doing from the air, we get anywhere between 1.4 and 1.8 million ducks. I say waterfowl, those are ducks, geese, and swans. So anywhere between 1.4 and 1.8 million ducks, geese, and swans in the Central Valley. Just a tremendous migratory stop and wintering stop for these birds. And within the last 15 years, it's been recognized as an international designation, a site of importance for shorebirds as well. And those shorebirds come in, a little bit more, I always say, cryptic. They're much small. They're not in the bigger groups. You have to really look for them spread across the valley, but tremendous importance for these birds. And so we started to look at, why it's so important. And at the most basic level, it's quite simply because we've lost 90 to 95% of the historic wetlands in this state since the early 1900s. So that's represented in this little pie chart there to give you that representation of what's left in this state. And really the main culprit of that is simply population growth and people, the needs surrounding, homes, increase in agriculture, infrastructure development. And from 1950 to 2023, we've gone from 10 million people to 40 million people. So just an increased impact to these habitats and these critters that use it. And we're trying to figure out how to mitigate those impacts, really. And so we kicked off this study over about 6 years, looking at wintering waterfowl. Again, those are the ducks and geese in this case. And we tracked their movements, 14 different species. And if you look at these pictures, the one on the right is a duck, a blue-winged teal that's got a little backpack on it. It has straps like a backpack around the wing. It's got a shiny top there. That's actually a solar panel that charges the battery. And the device itself acts just like a cell phone. It talks to cell phone towers, and about every 30 minutes, it records a GPS location of where that bird is. And it's got a resolution to about 3 feet. So really, really good technology to understand how these birds are moving. And I should say, just like a cell phone, it goes in and out of cell coverage, but there's a memory card in there that records all that data. And as soon as it interacts with the cell tower again, then we get that data downloaded, and we can get that real time in the computer. And similarly, on the snow goose on the left is a collar. The snow geese have longer necks, and if you try to put a backpack on it, they literally just turn their head around and rip it off. So a neck collar works for them. And I should say both of these devices are very light, less than 3% of the body weight of the bird. So the studies that have been done suggest that it doesn't impact the bird's survival or its behavior. So we kicked off this study, a ton of data to look at where these birds are going, how they're using habitat, what things are important to them. And one of the first things we found, rather amazingly, looking at that red X there is approximately the Yolo wildlife area. And All these tracks are where these birds went after the winter time. So each individual dot, and then those tracks are lots of dots together. So you can see when these birds left Yolo Wildlife Area, oh, approximately February to April, they went everywhere from, well, some went south to Mexico, some went east to what we consider the Central Flyway or Mississippi Flyway. We actually had one go to Louisiana, and then north as far as Arctic Canada, even around past, even she's east of that, and then west all the way to Siberia and mainland Russia. So these birds are coming from all over the place to basically the Central Valley, to the habitats like Yolo Wildlife Area each winter. And to give you an idea of how much these birds travel, um, these couple of examples, one bird just in the wintertime, so this is just between October and January, the bird flew over 1,500 miles. So these birds are getting up, they're exploring, they're, returning to the wildlife area on a regular basis, but, really covering a lot of ground. And they, as that graphic alludes, they don't travel straight when they're going nesting to a nesting habitat. This example, this bird traveled from basically right around the Yolo Wildlife Area to Alaska to nest, and she traveled 2,732 miles to get there. And a straight line would have been about 900 miles. So just covering a ton of ground, and using a lot of energy. Just amazing how far these birds can fly. And one of the really fun things we got to do with the work is, given that we had data points every 30 minutes, we could look at how far a bird traveled during that time and estimate their flight speeds. So during migration, these birds were averaging 40 to 50 miles per hour, with peak speeds well over 80 miles per hour. 70 miles, 75 miles an hour wasn't uncommon at all. And non-migratory flights, so during the winter time when they're just moving from one area to another or flying out at night to feed, they're averaged 23 to 39 miles per hour, with peak speeds 60 to 80 miles per hour. So again, these birds can, if you're sitting in Yolo Wildlife Area and you want to fly north into the rice country, say around Calusa, and you can average 40 miles per hour and hit peak speeds of 60 miles per hour with no stoplights and no traffic, it's not a bad flight at all for them. So really changing the way we look at how these birds are using these habitats and these landscapes. And shorebirds, we don't have the technology yet to really track them like that. These birds are too small and the devices are too heavy, but we're starting to get a lot more data from them, and they're very similar to our waterfowl, and that their nesting as far east and north as Russia, Siberia, a lot of Arctic habitats coming down the central part of our continent and heading over to the Central Valley. And then, unlike a lot of our waterfowl, a lot of these shorebirds are going even further south. So they're going to Mexico, Central America, and a number goes far south to South America. So these little birds are covering a lot of ground. They don't have really the capacity to store a lot of fat, to build a lot of fat reserves, to hold that energy. And they need to eat a lot. They need to stop and they need to eat. And that's really what the Central Valley and the Yolo Wildlife Area provides for these birds, is this areas to stop and rest, to get that food up again, get the fat reserves loaded, and then head on to their next stop. So really important stops along their way that without that they wouldn't be able to complete their migrations. So as we look at this now, we realize that these wetland habitats are really critical to the survival of these migratory birds. These birds are traveling hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to winter in very specific locations. A lot of almost every bird that we tracked for multiple years returned to the same site in the winter. So they're very, very much keyed in on what worked for them. If they survived that year, if they found the food that they needed and were able to return to their breeding grounds, then they came back to the same spot. So a lot of what we call fidelity. So these birds are coming back to the same areas, um, trying to find all those nutrients they need, those opportunities to survive, and really to socialize with other birds. When they're coming back up to breed, a lot of times birds are pairing up. The males are sticking with females, they're going to the same breeding areas. And one of the things we were able to find with females is that if they were successful in nesting, they return very close to where they nest before. So again, a lot of fidelity. So in the face of that, California being, lost most of its wetlands, um, we're faced with this need as managers, as wildlife biologists and scientists to create the best quality wetlands we can, to enhance those wetlands and provide the best habitat we can. So a lot of what we do now and what we do out at the wildlife area, working with groups like Ducks Unlimited, um, California Waterfowl Association, UC Davis, um, and throughout the valley with the Rice Commission and others, is to build more wetlands. Um, One of the things we can do now, compared to say a natural wetland that floods through rainfall, is control the water and control how long it's flooded, how deep it's flooded, um, and really then grow a suite of plants and aquatic invertebrates, aquatic insects that these birds need to eat. So we can really produce habitats that have much, much, much higher food value than what occurred here historically. And what we're starting to find is that those high quality habitats have a higher density of birds, can support more birds than they've ever supported before. So really, in many ways, a fantastic success story with waterfowl, where we've lost so much habitat, but our waterfowl populations in general are as high as they've ever been. So through that management, through the preservation of these habitats, able to really promote these species. Really amazing work. And that's all I have. So happy to answer any questions about that. I went through some of the research quickly.
That's great. Fantastic overview. Looks like we've got a question from Carter. Go ahead, Carter.
Hi, so I actually have a couple different questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
So I mean, first when you talked about like the GPS, just like how much in the range would that cost? Because you're talking about like 14 species, millions of birds, like what's the cost and distribution of that?
The cost? Is that what you said? I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit on me.
Oh, sorry, I was just talking about like, yeah, like if we're tracking like 14 species, millions of birds, like what would be the cost of that?
Well, actually, it started out fairly expensive. Um, we spent over 7 years about $14 million, and most of that was the devices, the technology. The backpack started out at a cost of about $1,500 a piece, and then we worked with the company that was making them. And actually, 2 years into the study, NASA reached out to us, and NASA scientists said that they were looking to diversify and show that their agency could do more than just go to space. Could they help us? And the NASA scientists actually improved the technology tremendously. And so we were able to really reduce that cost to a few $100s a transmitter by the time we were done. And so very, millions of dollars. The flip side of that is, we didn't have a lot of staff time. So it didn't require a lot of manpower to do this because it was all technology. So we actually saved a lot of money if we would have compared it to using people to do all that work and try to track these birds.
All right, great, thank you. And would you mind if I ask a couple more questions?
No, I'm fine with that. I think we have the time.
So you talked a lot about like ensuring high quality wetlands, but with like a lot of the California easement laws of, oh, if you mess with the habitat, just make a new one somewhere else. Like, how do you legally ensure these new created wetlands are like high quality?
That's a great question. That science has come a long way. Um, what what we try to do in those instances is look at the wetlands that are being lost, their depth, their flooding cycle, the species of wildlife that they support and plants they support, and then recreate that. So, build a pond, dig it out to the same depths, maybe add some diversity to it. One way you can improve a habitat is to have multiple depths. So, like in this, that final picture I have up, there's an island in the middle, there's peninsulas. That diversity provides habitat for a whole bunch of species. So we will build those things, and then we'll spend 3 to 5 years collecting data to see how they work, and then use that data as a means to then make changes as needed. And sometimes that means redoing the whole darn thing. So we now have enough data and enough of that feedback loop, if you will, to really build good quality wetlands.
All right, great. And then do you mind if I ask just one more question? Sorry.
Sure.
So I've been reading up about like the sort of walking wetland program, like Nagiri Ranch. And I was
Mhm.
just wondering like how does like soil management, pesticides, different like crop management techniques affect like the quality of the wetland and like the migratory birds?
It's a good question. Really, in the vast majority of the Central Valley in particular, farmers, Nagiri, the rice community has done such a great job of restricting their pesticide and herbicide use and using ones that really have minimal impact to the environment, that 99% of the time it really isn't an issue. We've really we made a lot of strides towards that. And the soil health is another question altogether. And the Nagiri Ranch is one where we're able to, through creating these wetlands and flooding and working with the rice industry, really create healthier soils. The soils need plants decomposing in them, that whole cycle of aquatic invertebrates. And through that management, we really do get healthier soils.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Alvita, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. This year's Envirothon theme is adapting to a changing climate.
Mm.
And we are very familiar about the extreme, if not severe, drought we've had in parts of California until this year with the atmospheric rivers that have kind of like churned their way throughout the state. And I was wondering, Cliff, before the rains, with the drought, a lot of these wetlands and rice fields were drying and dried up. They were mud flats at best. And
Mhm.
so what happens to our bird populations, our waterfowl? Do they just keep flying over because they can't find their nesting grounds? They can't find food or any place to rest? What has been your observations?
That's a great question. And, you know, in general, yeah, the birds move around a lot more, but in a lot of cases with the waterfowl in particular, the habitats that we had, like on the east side of the valley this year around Gray Lodge, that area had some water and had tremendous bird use. And then the birds moved further south, they moved into the delta, and they're really able to adapt. We're not sure, certainly they're not getting the food value. This year was unlike any I've seen in my 20 plus years in the valley, in that the rice farms that were dry weren't even stubble from the year before. They were dry the year before. So it was just dirt around these habitats. And so they provided no food value whatsoever. And I suspect that there's some body condition impacts, and that could translate into lower reproduction. And actually, on the heels of this telemetry work that we're doing, we still have radios on a few hundred birds right now, and we got money to add more. And we're going to be able to compare this drought year to the previous years and understand where those birds went, how much more they traveled, and what those impacts really were. So I hope within the next 2 years, we'll have a nice publication that will actually answer those questions for us.
That's great. Thank you, Cliff.
Yeah.
I've got one question in the chat. What kind of foods are typically grown in the new wetlands being made?
Ah, very good. A combination of most of these wetlands that are for these migratory birds are flooded. They're wet mostly October through February or so, and then they're dry in the summer months, and then they flood up again. And that kind of mimics the natural hydrology, if you will, if you follow our rainfall patterns and the flooding of the rivers. So it mimics that. And so when these ponds are dry, the plants that grow in there, we can really, through management, select plants that produce a whole bunch of seeds, and then flood those ponds in the fall, and there's a bunch of plant seeds in there. And so the birds get in there and eat those plant seeds. And then as the plants start to decompose, it causes the aquatic insects to really take off. That energy from the plants feeds the bugs. And so the birds then shift towards eating a lot of the aquatic bugs. And we can maintain the aquatic bug population by managing the water effectively. So early bugs, early seeds, late in the season bugs, and dry the pond out and then cycle it again.
That's great. Any more questions for Cliff from anybody? If not, we'll move on to our next speaker. I think we'll move on to Donna Ball, sort of continuing the topic of created wetlands and wetland restoration. So I'd like to introduce Donna Ball. She is a lead scientist for the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, as well as a senior scientist working with the San Francisco Bay Estuary Institute on shoreline adaptation projects and projects in the Delta. As a strong conservation leader, scientist, and collaborator and mentor with over 15 years of experience in the San Francisco Bay marshes and estuaries, Donna has been a contributor to many Bay Area projects and currently serves on the Technical Advisory Committee as co-chair for the Wetland Regional Monitoring Program. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Donna. Thank you for being here.
Great, thanks, Justin. You can see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm going to move us into San Francisco Bay, to the Bay Area itself, and talk to you about a wetland restoration project where we're trying to manage for both tidal marsh species as well as for some of these important migratory bird species. So we're really lucky. We live in this really cool area that has lots of culture and the Bay Area, the Bay itself. But despite being this huge area, we have 7.5 million people in the Bay Area. We also have these really great tidal marshes and broad expanses of marshes, as well as the sloughs and some of the channels that support those. So it's not one of the things you think of when you think of going to San Francisco, for example. In addition to these really great tidal marshes, the Bay Area for over about 150 years has commercial salt production that's been happening most recently through Cargill salt. So a large number of ponds in the Bay are used for commercial salt production and have been used for a long time. And so when you fly into the Bay, particularly if you fly into San Jose, you see these ponds of these various colors. And those colors are the result of, there's a lot of really nice, cool microbes and bacteria that use the ponds, and that's what causes the color of the ponds. And so in 2003, Cargill Salt sold over 15,000 acres of those ponds to the public. And the public meaning U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Game. And between 2003 and 2007, we did a lot of planning of how to restore these ponds to tidal marshes, because that's the historic loss that I'll be talking about here in a minute. And then started doing restoration in 2007. So, sorry, I skipped around here. So how much is 15,000 acres? Well, the thing that you can compare, it's hard to think about in terms of these ponds, these individual ponds, but it's about the size of Manhattan. And so a little bit of history, up until the 1800s, we had these huge expanses of tidal marsh throughout the Bay. And by 1998, we only had about 10% of those left. We lost about 90% of the wetlands, similar to what happened in the Central Valley and in the Delta. And so that loss was really attributed to urbanization, creation of these salt ponds for salt production, and agriculture. So big loss of tidal wetlands. And so this project's important because 15,000 acres is a big gain towards regaining back some of those important tidal marshes in the estuary. So this just shows you where the project's located that I'll be talking about today. The green areas are ponds that are owned by and managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the blue ponds sort of towards the top of the map are ponds that are owned and managed by California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Then the ponds that are in pink and orange are actually still in commercial salt production, and Cargill still owns those lands. So this project has three main goals: habitat restoration. I'll be talking about each of these individually: wildlife compatible public access and flood risk management. And the project is supported by a really robust adaptive management plan, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. But it's actually a three-part project. We have three phases to the project. And the project says 50 years in the making. So it'll be 50 years before we complete it. We completed the first one around 2012. And now phase two, we're in the middle of restoring marshes as part of the second phase of the project. And we're hoping to get to a ratio at the end of 50 years of 90% tidal marsh and 10% managed ponds, which are ponded areas that we've retained for wildlife, such as waterbirds. At the end of phase two, we'll be at which is coming up in the next probably 5 years, we'll have a ratio of 50-50. And I'll be talking about why we're going to find that it's hard to get to this 90-10 ratio. Key uncertainties for the project going in, you think you can just go breach all these ponds, turn them into tidal marsh, but we really had a lot of questions about how the wildlife, specifically the bird species, would use these habitats. If there's enough sediment to actually create tidal marsh. A lot of these ponds are really deeply subsided due to groundwater withdrawal. In the far South Bay, there was a lot of mercury mining historically, and so there's a lot of legacy mercury that's buried in some of these ponds. And then thinking about water quality and invasive species, some of the things we typically think about when we do restoration and how to create public access. And over time, sea level rise and climate change has become a bigger factor for us to consider. So I'm just going to walk through the goals and focus mainly on the habitat restoration goal. I mentioned that we've lost 90% of the tidal marshes in the bay, and we're hoping to recreate some of those tidal marshes specifically for these two species on the bottom. The Ridgway's rail, which is a secretive marsh bird that likes to use the sloughs and channels, and this salt marsh harvest mouse on the bottom right-hand corner. Both of these species use tidal marshes. Both are federally endangered species and endemic only to San Francisco Bay. So it's really important that we get habitat back for these two species. And that seems simple enough, except that over the last 150 years that these areas have been used as commercial salt production areas, a lot of the water birds and ground nesting birds have come to use these as habitats over that period of time. A lot of water birds used for breeding and for nesting and for stopovers. And then the top left-hand corner is a snowy plover, which is a threatened species. It's a ground nesting bird and uses the ponds when they dry out. So it's not really simple to just restore to tidal marsh because we have, as Cliff was mentioning, a lot of these birds have a lot of fidelity to the regions where they go to nest and to breed. And so, and we're on the Pacific Flyway as well, similar to the rest of California. So it's really important, right, that we figure out what to do about these birds. So over time, we've been tracking bird species that have historically used these ponds. Some of the guilds of birds are doing well, the small shorebirds, and some of the dabbling ducks and diving ducks are doing pretty well. But there are other species that aren't doing as well. Avocets, stilts, and terns are species that we've been tracking for 20 years. And avocets and stilts are doing or at least stilts are doing pretty well. Avocets have been declining within the South Bay as a whole. And then Forster's terns, oddly enough, have been declining, but this year increased by about 150% in their nesting areas. So, a lot of questions for us. 20 years of bird monitoring, and we're still trying to answer questions. We're seeing declines in phalaropes in particular, but then we're part of some range-wide studies that are being done throughout the range at Mono Lake and Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake. We're seeing declines as well throughout the range. And so while they're important to us in San Francisco Bay, we're trying to tease out whether those factors are range-wide or whether they're local. An interesting fact about the phalaropes is that we see them as birds that use really high saline ponds, and they've come to start using ponds that are less saline over time. And so, that's another question for us to try to answer. So to try to make sure that we're providing some habitat for these birds as we restore tidal marshes, we're saving and creating habitat specifically for some of these waterbird species. And so each of these ponds throughout the project are like between 200 and 400 acres. So they're pretty large, right? So we're able to do some big experiments. The image that you see on the left is an image of a pond that was in the eastern part of the bay in Eden Landing. And these ponds were divided. We divided this pond into different cells with different salinities so that the birds that preferred prey in different salinities would have access to prey resources. And so it was also a big experiment for the project to see if we could create these different types of habitats with different salinities. And then another question we had is, as these birds nest, where are they going to prefer nesting? So we created one of the ponds with a lot of islands in it to try to figure out whether these birds nest on round islands, linear islands, how big islands, how many islands, do they need a lot of islands or just a few? And so these are just some things that the project is doing to try to answer some of these questions. We're doing social attraction surveys where we put out decoys, and we've been really successful, particularly with Forster's terns, at getting birds to nest in those areas. And then removing predators are a big issue for the waterbird species and the snowy plover. And so we're trying to remove predator perches and do enhancements like adding gravel and oyster shell and things like that to try to help these birds in their nesting. So as I said, this is really a big challenge. So it's the biggest challenge that the project has is managing for these competing species needs. I just want to step back and tell you about our successes with tidal marsh restoration, because that's our big goal. Tidal marshes establish fairly quickly in the bay if we have enough sediment and marshes are near the elevation. So this is just an example of a marsh that restored pretty quickly. In about 2015 or so, we actually started seeing species using the marsh. So another big question, I think you mentioned adapting to a changing climate. Thinking about sea level rise, we're really hoping that we'll have enough sediment to continue to restore marshes. As I said, many of these are subsided ponds. And so this is a big question for the project. So far, we're doing really well, and marshes are establishing within about 10 years, but it is a question for us as sea level rises. So we're doing some things in the marsh to help adapt for the species that use the marsh in particular. We're creating these transition zones at the edges of the marshes so that as sea level does rise, we can think about ways that the species can migrate as well as the marsh to migrate uphill sort of. So we're creating these transition zones, then vegetating them with species that the rail and the mouse, the species that we're really managing for, can use. Flood risk management, I won't go a lot into this. This is one of the other goals of the project. And, our goal is to not make flooding worse, right, as part of the project. And so we're working with flood control agencies and other partners such as Shoreline Project and Safer Bay in the Bay to really find ways that we can collaborate on flood risk management. So just to give you an idea of what restoration could look like, this pond that's labeled Pond R4 will be breached to tidal marsh next year. It's almost 300 acres, and it'll be restored. We'll restore some channels, and it'll be a nice feature that provides connectivity with marshes all around the area. But we are holding this Pond R3 at the bottom. This is right next to Facebook. We're saving this pond that's almost 300 acres for nesting snowy plover and other water birds that use it in the winter. And then the little tiny square in the bottom left-hand corner, ponds R5 and S5, will be maintained as deeper water habitat for more of the birds that need that. So we're trying to manage, this is just a cool way to explain how we're trying to manage for all of these competing needs at the same time. And similar, this is the site on the east side of the bay where it'll be used by water birds for now. And then as we restore to tidal marsh, some of those tidal marsh species will start to move in. Just briefly, our third goal is public access and recreation. We're trying to restore to tidal marsh. We have endangered and threatened species using the areas that we're restoring. And so our goal is to create areas for the public to be out and enjoy and understand restoration. And some of these places are really remote, so it's really cool for the public to be able to get out there. But we also have to recognize that we want to protect those species as well. So we want to manage it in a way so that public access doesn't impede their success. So we're doing a pretty good job of that, but that's another thing that we have to always consider. So as I said, we have this adaptive management plan. It's really breaks out into, for each thing that we're thinking about, be it water birds or tidal marsh species or water quality, we set up a whole plan where we look at each parameter and we think about what our goals are and what kinds of things we need to monitor and what we will do if our monitoring doesn't give us the answers that we're hoping for. And so we use kind of what we call targets and triggers to really give us somewhat of a stoplight of, yeah, we're doing well or we're not doing so well. And so as part of my job is to really make sure that we have a strong science program to support that. We had a climate synthesis that we did about 2 years ago that really gave us a chance to think again about climate adaptation and the changing climate. How will we adapt and what kinds of things can the project do? And we regularly engage the public through stakeholder meetings. And we did a science symposium last year, and you can go to the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project website, and all the live talks are posted on our website. So if you want to learn more about the science. And this is just a sample thinking about how we're doing managing for competing species. We're managing for this sediment. Are we creating marshes? But we're also doing a lot of I would say most of our monitoring is around water birds and nesting birds and breeding birds to try to understand, making sure that we're not taking habitat away from them and we're helping their populations thrive. And so that's pretty much it. There's a lot I could tell you, but I think your focus is kind of on water birds. And so I wanted to make most of my focus emphasized on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna. Any questions? Go ahead, Elvita.
I have a question. One of the things that we want our students to be aware of is how can we involve communities of color, disadvantaged communities. I know you mentioned having stakeholder meetings, but you were looking at the South Bay and there's East Palo Alto, which, as you know, is a big community of color and low income. I was wondering, other than stakeholder meetings, is there a way of recruiting youth or even the parents to be part of the project in terms of doing observations or monitoring along with some of the biologists when they're out there doing that?
We haven't done that as much in the past. I think the project is thinking a lot more about that going forward. Yeah, East Palo Alto, Alviso, there are communities there. I think the biggest intersection for the project is around flood control. We have had some of our recent work in the past 5 years or so is really focused on the area. In Menlo Park, there's a flood area there that floods into a sensitive community all the time. And so we've been working with flood control agencies to try to help mitigate that. There aren't, I wouldn't say directly, because a lot of our science is done by partners. And so San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, I know, uses volunteers from time to time. We get some of their surveys done on eBird, which is volunteers that they train to go out and do surveys for us. Save the Bay and Point Blue both do some work on our project from time to time, and I know use volunteers. So I guess that would probably be maybe the best intersection. Most of our, at the level where I'm at, is mostly around making management decisions and trying to manage. But yeah, it's an area we think about because, and that in tribal outreach, we've been trying to do a lot more with communities.
I just want to follow up on your question. Can you elaborate more on what you mean about tribal outreach? Because that's another area of emphasis for our program.
Yeah, historically, the people who really know the most about managing the land have been here for a long, long time and continue to be here. And I think we're trying to, as we do things in this next phase, we've been asking for input from tribes on some of our signage for public outreach and inviting tribal members to stakeholder meetings and trying to encourage more communities and tribes to be actually involved in the project. It is one of those things that kind of marches along, and unless people get an invitation, I think often they aren't able to be involved. And so we're just trying to find better ways to do that work.
Thank you.
One question in the chat. When you need sediment, do you use soil in place or do you import sediment?
So far, the soil in place has, the sediment that's in the system has been adequate. We know that's not going to be the case going forward. Some of these ponds are subsided by like 10 feet. So we're trying to find ways to get, I mean, my other counterpart, SFEI, is like, yeah, we need to connect watersheds with the bay. That's not going to happen fast enough, probably. So we're looking at maybe dredge materials and other sources. We have been able to we build these transition zones that I mentioned on the edge, and we use construction soils for that because they aren't wetted soils. They're on more of an upland area. And there's a lot of construction in the bay, so we've been able to get a lot of that soil dirt for free because they need a place to get rid of it. So there actually are people called dirt brokers out there that kind of manage dirt. And so we've been able to work with some of them to get dirt on the edge to build habitat. But yeah, going forward, sediment's going to be the big question for us is, are we going to have enough? And where can we get it if we don't?
May I ask a follow-up question on that? What about some of the clean dredge materials? Because I know that, as you know, the estuary and parts of the bay are routinely dredged for cargo traffic. Is that something that could be usable if it's clean?
It's totally could be usable. It's one of the things we research all the time. The big challenge is the cost and the feasibility of transport. So areas in the far South Bay, for example, are really shallow. And so how do we get it there? That's the question. And some of those ways of getting it moved around are really, really pricey for us. So it still remains a challenge, but oh yeah, we'd take it in a heartbeat if we could get it.
I kind of thought so. Thank you.
One more question in the chat. How are these projects being funded?
This project was funded originally by some private grants, but now we do a lot of state, from pretty much anywhere we can get the money, state, federal, EPA grants, state money. The State Coastal Conservancy manages the project, so we look for funds through them. But yeah, a lot of different sources, private, federal, government, state, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Donna. That was very interesting work and definitely a lot of challenges but great work that you all are doing on that. So thanks for that overview. So let's go to our last speaker this afternoon. So Tim Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, is the president and CEO of the California Rice Commission. And, I had mentioned, how important rice fields are for habitat for bird species, 7 to 10 million ducks, geese, and other shorebirds along the Flyway. So with that, Tim, thanks for being here, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Sorry for the technical glitches. I assume everybody can see me okay? Great.
Yep, great.
Thumbs up, Donna. For those of us who are also sound, I also wear hearing aids. So I just want to talk about rice fields in the same context. You've heard from Cliff, you've heard from Donna about these great wetland projects, and the comment's been made a number of times about the loss of wetlands in our region. And this is what the Sacramento Valley used to look like, right? And this is unfortunately what it looks like now, right? So you've gone from riparian lands, seasonal wetlands, to farming, right? Due largely to the fact that we put dams and levees up to keep our cities from flooding. Farmers being what farmers are, they decided that'd be a good spot to farm. Now, in the case of rice, it's pretty interesting in that rice really fits a really interesting gap. So as you look at what rice, it's kind of our footprint in the Sacramento Valley, about 500,000 acres. 97% of it is grown in that Sacramento Valley area. So really from Sacramento North to about Redding. So we're very highly sort of concentrated in the Sac Valley. And we grow sushi rice out here. If you were wondering what it is, it's the rice you enjoy when you eat sushi. And why is that 500,000 acres of rice important? As folks have noted, about 95% of our historic wetlands are gone. And as groups like Point Blue, groups like Caltrout, Donna's group, Cliff's group, everybody works to try to maximize, right? Scrape every last acre that you can, restore it to useful habitat for any number of species. How do you do that? We realized about 30 years ago that rice fields could be managed in a way that really created surrogate wetlands. They're not exactly equal to a wetland. About 1 acre of rice or wetland, rather, it takes about 1.3 acres of rice to equal an acre of wetland from a food value during the certain times of year. But what makes rice really unique is because we flood it to grow it, about 5 inches of water, it can serve these really cool and awesome needs. One of them is nesting habitat, an avocet that you've seen before, one of the species that utilizes our rice fields. These are all pictures of birds and some other species that utilize rice fields. Actually, will nest right in a rice field. We have stilts, we have some avocets will utilize our fields. We have black terns actually will nest right out in the middle of the field, and plus many duck species, waterfowl species. And really what we're known for is that waterfowl. Talked about the Pacific Flyway, 7 to 10 million ducks and geese come in winter in the whole Central Valley. So we're the Sac Valley, which is the top part from Sacramento to Redding, but the rest of the Central Valley, which is San Joaquin Valley, goes really all the way down right from Sacramento to Bakersfield. 60%, over 60% of the food that those ducks and geese come down in the winter to eat is associated with a rice field. Again, we're not quite 1 for 1 for a wetland. Wetlands are hugely important. And then we have some other crops like corn that can be flooded in the wintertime to provide that food. And why is that important? Really, there are 2 charts here that to have you look at. The first one is really actually at the bottom. You can see where the blue or the gray line, depending on black line when you're looking at it, and the red line cross, that's about the end of December. Without rice in the Sacramento Valley, without the leftover rice, the weed seeds, the insects in our fields, those species would not have any food about the end of December, right? Pretty tough if you're trying to wait until about March, right, to be able to migrate north. With rice, you see that those numbers, in fact, do not, or those lines do not cross. And we ask ourselves occasionally questions, what would happen if we had less rice, less than that 500,000 acres in the Sacramento Valley? Unfortunately, this last year, we saw the blue bar, right? We grew half as much rice this last year because of the drought. And we figure that the duck populations were impacted on the level of about 1 million birds, less carrying capacity in the Sacramento Valley, which is kind of how biologists look at it. What does that look like? If you looked at what a rice field kind of looked like and what does that flooded rice field look like, you can see the pictures on the left, right? You've got shallow, flooded, muddy fields. There's plenty of sediment there, so we get really great biological activity. You've got the leftover rice grain from the harvest. You've got insects and weed seeds, all told about 700 pounds of food per acre in a rice field. You can see the picture on the bottom there is a larger landscape picture. There's the Sutter Buttes there. And you can just see these shallow flooded fields that are just dominate the life or the landscape. We figure about 300,000 acres of that 500,000 are purposely flooded for the purposes of decomposing rice straw and for habitat in the Sacramento Valley. And then you see the response. On the bottom there, you see some pintail, male and females. They're a great user of rice fields, and you can see what we get a chance and our farmers get a chance to see in that upper right-hand corner, which is just massive use of these rice fields for feeding by these ducks and geese. We're also very important to shorebirds. I know we a lot of focus on shorebirds, and we think of wetlands and people don't think of farmers, or if you do, you think, well, I've probably taken away from what I'm interested in, shorebirds. But in fact, the Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences a number of years ago designated the wetlands and rice fields in the Sacramento Valley as shorebird habitat of international significance, right? You've seen the pictures of the massive migrations of shorebirds. And they'll go all the way from Alaska all the way down to South America. They use our fields a little differently than our waterfowl. So we manage those a little differently. You want, for us in the Sac Valley, you want a little bit earlier flooding, right? Not that typical sort of November through till about the end of February. You'd like to get that habitat out there in October. And if we can do that, the shorebirds really thrive. We also want to hold that habitat a little bit longer in the springtime to accommodate their migrations. And so this is what it looks like. About 230 species of wildlife are known. There's your Fowler up, known to live in rice fields, about 300,000 acres flooded. And if you had to make that into a wetland, it'd be about 250,000 acres of wetland that you would need to go out and put out there. And a cost of about $3 billion. And I know when Donna was asked, these things are tremendously expensive. We say that we want to go out and build a wetland, but the costs and even the ongoing management, right, is tremendously expensive. And if we can partner, and by say we, rice farmers, with Point Blue, with folks like Cal Trout, Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, and others, what we know is that we can provide this great habitat and still grow rice. I'll just close with a quick set of slides on a cool new thing we're doing. I know we're talking about ducks, but I want to talk about salmon in the Sacramento Valley. And what we have started to realize is that salmon in the floodplain, primarily in the Yolo bypass area, which Cliff talked about, that was actually the natural habitat for all the species, all of the 4 runs of salmon in the Sacramento Valley. These are actually 2 fish that were reared at the same time, hatched at the same time. The top one lived in the river, and that was me in high school. And then the bottom fish was reared in the Yolo Basin, actually in a rice field, and that's now me at 55, much fatter, a little bit taller. And why is that? It's because when you take that rice straw, which is about 3 tons per acre of leftover rice straw, you add water back to those fields after we harvest them, you add the sunlight and the energy from the sunlight, you grow zooplankton. One of the species here at the top right corner is, I believe, a Cereodaphne. So it's a water flea, but that's what those small salmon really evolved to eat. But they don't really grow in a fast-flowing Sacramento River. They like a floodplain. They like a wetland. And if they can access that wetland, they can get this food. And so what we're trying to do is to take our rice fields, and you can see on the left-hand side, the blue water, those are fields in the wintertime that would a little bit elevated, but that's what a flooded rice field would look like in the wintertime. In the middle there, you can see the experiments that we're doing. And the experiments look like this. Can we put, in this case, they're hatchery fish in a rice field, allow the water to be maybe a little bit deeper than it would normally be, and let that sunlight come in. And then when the fish choose, they can move in between the checks, the little divisions in the field. And when they're ready to migrate out, they can just actually go right back into the river. Now, right, their job is to get back out into the ocean. And so we did these experiments, and you can see this is some of the work that's being done by UC Davis and our friends also at Cal Trout, where we have some cages in the field where we can put a hatchery fish in, see how well they do, they thrive. We'll go ahead and capture them then. And you can see here all that work. And one of the things that we do is we actually put 2 types of tags in them. One is a tag that allows you to sort of generally see where the fish are going. And another is a satellite tag called a JSAT tag. We actually track that fish over time, not only the time that it would spend in the Yolo bypass in those rice fields that are there, but also as they then out-migrate through the Sacramento River into San Francisco. What we see is about a 4 times higher success in migrating. So right now, the success rate, if you hatchery fish getting out to through San Francisco is about 1 to 1.5%. And here we're in the 4 to 6% range. So a huge increase in the number of fish that are successful in going out. And we're really excited about using those same fields, right? In that same wetland and floodplain concept that we can do in rice, happening already in the wetlands, be able to do for salmon what we've been able to do for the Pacific Flyway. So I put questions down on the bottom, but I really just wanted you to see the picture of the snow geese, which are my favorite species, not because they're the prettiest, but because they sound the nicest. If you go out into a rice field in the wintertime, this time of year, particularly, you can actually feel the snow geese as they take off and all of their just cackling and all of the noise. You can hear their wing beats. It's quite spectacular. So that is what's happening in rice fields in the Sacramento Valley, that environmental benefit, that wetland-like benefit from just one of the crops that we grow here in the state.
That was fantastic. Really interesting stuff. And I think it fits really nicely into the whole theme of sort of collaboration and really how we can work together to really provide habitat. And I love the idea of, working farms also providing habitat. So it's a great perspective. So thank you very much for sharing that. Go ahead, Elvira.
Snow geese are one of my favorite bird species too, Tim. I know that they've been delisted like some years back, and it's because of the efforts of conservation groups and farmers and ranchers throughout the Central Valley. I'm thinking Mapes Ranch outside of Modesto. They were a cattle ranch. My point is, first of all, if you take rice growers out of the equation, these rice fields, we all know that the waterfowl and the salmon will be worse off if they were to go away. So my question is, what kind of incentives are given to rice growers to continue flooding their fields and growing organic rice? And plus, when you mention that rice fields have been designated as of some international significance because of critical habitat. So what gives them the motivation, the incentives to continue flooding their fields and allowing waterfowl to thrive?
Great question. And I think there's a couple of things. First of all, when we started really focusing on flooding fields for waterfowl at first, it was really our farmers came to us and said, we think we can do more here. They love to go out and see these species. They love to call and tell us they saw otters on the side of their ditch. They saw herons. They've see raccoons, of course, all the time. Even large species like tule elk will come down in the summers, right, and utilize rice fields. So they're very excited. They really are connected with the land that they farm. We've been able to develop a series of programs primarily through U.S. Department of Agriculture, their Natural Resources Conservation Service, which actually, if we can develop a practice, which is a set of things that we know and our science partners know will help, in this case, waterfowl, or in the future, salmon, they'll actually help offset some of the costs, the additional costs that the grower would have to undertake, flooding their field, managing those fields for salmon, as I had noted. So it's that combination of a deep personal connection and some public incentives to help growers offset these costs, because as much as you like a duck or a otter, it's not growing rice. And so you really are looking at these extra costs. And so that cost share is hugely important.
Thank you. I also want to add my great respect for rice growers because of their practices in the past in terms of not using Ordram, the herbicide, and stop burning the rice stubble on their fields, which created a huge air quality problem in the valley. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I know an earlier question was mentioned about pesticides. I appreciate my colleagues answering that. And yes, we are very careful about the materials that we use on our fields and when we use them so that we don't impact other species. And, being acknowledged by regulators that, growers really take that stuff seriously. When we know that there's a problem, or even when we hear there's a problem, we use UC Davis and others to help us investigate. And that's a big deal for farmers. And so thank you for that recognition.
There's a question in the chat. Who is responsible for maintaining the levees?
Right. So as in like all things, right, it's very complicated, but the levees, the major levees in the Sacramento Valley, and I can't speak to other areas, I just know this one, there's actually levee control districts that have the ability to assess a parcel, a certain fee per year, and maintain those levees. And so it's usually levee districts up and down the Sacramento Valley that maintain those districts. In some cases, groups of farmers will maintain levees, but largely you think about it like any other kind of a public utility, but on a smaller scale.
Another question in the chat. Do any of these large bird populations affect nutrient cycling on the farms?
Yeah, in fact, one of the first things that our farmers came and told us is we like to have the ducks and geese on our fields in the wintertime. And the reason is not only do they churn up all that rice straw that we've chopped right after harvest, we've flooded, we've disked it lightly into the field to get that soil, straw and water connection. The ducks and the geese add just a lot of fertilizer to those fields. And we know we can capture that nitrogen and use less fertilizer in our fields the next year. They also eat a lot of the weed seeds that would otherwise be present and help us have far less weed pressure. Maybe we don't have to spray as many crop protection materials or pesticides as you would know them. So it's really a great combination where we give a little bit of leftover rice to the geese and the ducks, and they give us some fertilizer and help us decompose that rice straw.
Another question in the chat, has avian flu been detected?
Yes, in fact, one of the, and I'm sure Cliff and others will have a thought on this as well. We were desperately concerned this year about, as a result of the drought, the lack of available habitat, right? We know we grew 250,000 acres less rice. There was less flooded rice fields in the winter. We know wetlands had difficulty also accessing water. The drought affected many of the state and federal wildlife refuges. And what that does is that concentrates the birds on the habitat that is available. And the avian flu, also avian cholera and botulism, which are also endemic diseases, are just have much more of an opportunity to spread. We did see early indications of avian flu. We had a species that were succumbing to it. We did two things. One of the best things that happened was all the rain that we got here in the end of December. But before that, we worked with the Department of Water Resources and also with Nature Conservancy to identify fields in areas that desperately needed habitat. If that field had a well on it, even if it did not grow rice, the state of California incentivized farmers to pump groundwater to flood those fields so that we could spread those birds out more across the landscape. We think that early habitat in November and December before the rains came was really quite key in keeping the impacts of avian flu down on the Pacific Flyway this year.
Tim, I'll add real quickly. We've been monitoring avian flu and waterfowl in particular very closely, and really it doesn't seem to affect much of the population.
Good.
I mean, it hit the snow geese. Lots of people saw snow geese that weren't afraid of people. They wouldn't flush. They wouldn't, and those were avian flu birds. And it gave the perception that there was a lot of snow geese that got avian flu. But we've got to remember in the Sacramento Valley, we've got about 800,000 snow geese. So we estimate right now that it affected less than 1% of the population.
Outstanding.
But monitoring it very closely to see how it expands, how it might expand to other species, and how they might respond.
Great. Are there any last questions for any one of our three speakers here before we wrap up? Well, again, I again very much want to thank Cliff and Tom and Donna for really outstanding presentations, and I appreciate you taking the time to share all of your knowledge and all the great work that all three of you are doing with the students here, and very much appreciate you being here.
Thanks for inviting us. I always enjoy learning from other speakers too. I learned a lot today, so thanks.
Yeah,
And I
you.
thank you all and all the students and teachers who did attend this webinar. Thank you.